The dust had not even settled behind her horse before Wallace Ashford set down his coffee cup, walked to the front door of his ranch house, and saw something that would alter the entire shape of his life. She came riding in at dusk on a gray mare that looked like it had been ridden half to death, her dark hair loose and wild around her shoulders, her jaw set like carved stone. In one arm she held a bundle of blankets pressed tight against her chest, and across her lap lay a Winchester rifle, resting easy as if it had always been there. She did not call out. She did not wave. She rode right up to the porch steps and stopped, and her eyes met his with the kind of directness that most men in Calhoun County, Texas, would not have been able to hold. Wallace Ashford held it just fine. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with sun-darkened skin and hands that had been calloused since he was 14. He had inherited the Double-A ranch from his father 6 years ago, and he had built it into something real through work that left no room for much else. He was not an unkind man. He was not an unwelcoming man. But he was, by most accounts, a solitary one. His neighbors said he preferred his cattle to his company, and they were not wrong about that. He looked at the woman on the horse, at the bundle in her arms that let out a sound so small and thin it barely reached him over the evening wind, at the rifle on her lap, and he understood precisely 3 things. She had come a long way, she was not going to explain herself easily, and whatever she needed she had decided he was the one who was going to provide it. He stepped aside and said, "Come in." That was how it began. No formal introduction. No explanation requested. No negotiation over terms. He simply moved out of the doorway and held the screen door open, and she dismounted from that exhausted horse with her baby in one arm and her rifle in the other hand, climbed the 3 porch steps, walked past him, and entered Wallace Ashford's house. He went out and took her horse to the barn himself, rubbing the animal down, giving it water and a full measure of grain, doing for it what any decent man of the frontier would do for a creature that had been pushed past its limits. When he came back inside, she was sitting at his kitchen table. The rifle was leaned against the wall beside her, within easy reach. The baby was awake now, quiet but alert, dark eyes open and blinking in the lamplight. She was nursing the child with a blanket draped over herself for modesty, and she looked up at him when he came through the door with an expression that was somewhere between exhaustion and pride. "There's food on the stove," he said. "Beans and salt pork. Been keeping warm since noon." "Thank you," she said. Her voice was lower than he expected, steadier than most people's voices were after whatever she had clearly been through. He fixed her a bowl and set it on the table in front of her without ceremony. He poured her a cup of water from the pitcher. He sat down on the other side of the table with his own coffee and did not ask her a single question. She finished nursing the baby, adjusted the child against her shoulder and patted its back gently, and then reached forward and picked up the spoon with her free hand and ate. She ate like a person who had not had a proper meal in 2 days, methodical and focused, not quite desperate but close enough to it that he made a point of looking at the wall instead of at her. When the bowl was empty, she set the spoon down and sat back. "I am Letitia Garner," she said. "Wallace Ashford," he replied. She nodded as if she already knew that, which unsettled him slightly but which he did not remark on. "The baby's name is Rosalind," she said. "She is 4 months old." He looked at the child, then at the dark curls already forming at the edges of her scalp, at the tiny, perfect hands. "She is healthy. She is strong," Letitia said, and there was something fierce in the way she said it, something that brooked no argument. "Good," he said. Another silence stretched between them. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere far out on the range, and the wind moved against the window glass. "I can work," Letitia said. "I am not looking for charity. I can cook, clean, mend, tend a garden, I can shoot." He glanced at the Winchester. "I noticed." "I'm not asking to stay forever," she said, and her voice was careful but her eyes said something different, something she was not ready to let out yet. "I just need somewhere to be for a while." "The spare room is at the end of the hall," he said. "The bed is made up. There is a hook on the back of the door for your things." She looked at him for a moment longer than felt comfortable, as if she was trying to find the trick in what he had said, the hidden cost, the thing that would be held over her later. She did not find it because there was none. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. He washed up the dishes while she carried the baby down the hall. He heard the door at the end of the corridor close quietly. He finished washing up and stood at the window over the sink for a while, looking out at the dark Texas sky, at the stars that were so thick out here away from any town that they seemed layered on top of each other. He had not had another person in this house since his ranch hand Clem Purdy had broken his leg last winter and spent 3 weeks sleeping in the kitchen until he could get around on his own again. And before that, a long time before that, there had been a woman named Clara who had come to visit, and who had left after deciding that the double A and its quiet owner were not enough for her. He did not begrudge Clara that decision. He understood it, but standing at the sink tonight, with the sound of another human being settling in at the end of his hall, with the echo of a baby's soft breath still in his ears, Wallace Ashford felt something shift in his chest that he could not have named precisely. It was not yet love. It was something quieter and older than love, something that felt like the way the land felt before spring arrived, when everything was still cold but the quality of the cold had changed. He went to bed. The morning came bright and hard and yellow, the way mornings in Texas came in September of 1882, and Wallace was already at the barn before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. He had 24 head of cattle that needed moving to the south pasture, a fence line along the creek that needed patching before winter, and a deal with a buyer in Abilene that he needed to write a letter about before the week was out. He did not think about Letitia Garner while he was throwing hay, because there was no room to think about anything when you were throwing hay. He thought about her when he came back to the house at 7 in the morning and found his kitchen transformed. Not rearranged. Not disrupted. Transformed. The smell of coffee hit him before he got through the back door. Real coffee, the good kind, not the burned-down sludge he made for himself. He found biscuits on the stove, light and golden, and eggs scrambled with something, some dried herb she must have found in his pantry that he could not even have identified. The table was clean. His collection of papers and mail that had accumulated at one end of it had been neatly stacked and moved to the edge of the counter, not thrown away, not disturbed, just organized. Letitia was at the stove with Rosalind in a cloth sling that she wore across her chest, the baby tucked against her front like a small warm package, and she was pouring coffee into a mug with the ease of someone who had been using this kitchen for years. She turned when she heard him come in, and something crossed her face that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it. "Sit," she said. "It is ready." He sat. He was not a man who was served. He was a man who served himself, who had been doing so since his mother passed when he was 19, who had eaten standing at the kitchen counter more nights than he could count because setting a proper place at the table for one person seemed more like mourning than eating. Having someone place a plate in front of him, having the table set with actual purpose, felt foreign and strange, and if he was honest with himself in the small, quiet way that honesty was possible at 7 in the morning, unbearably nice. "You cook well," he said. "My mother was an excellent cook," she said. She sat across from him with her own plate and her coffee, adjusting Rosalind slightly in the sling. The baby had gone back to sleep against her chest. "I had good instruction." He ate. She ate. The morning light came in through the window over the table, and it fell across her face in a way that made him suddenly aware that she was remarkably beautiful, not in any soft or delicate way, but in the way that things shaped by difficulty and weather and persistence were beautiful. Her cheekbones were high and definite. Her brown eyes were clear and direct. The bruise along her left jaw, which he had not noticed in the lamplight the previous night, was several days old and yellowing at the edges. He looked at his plate. She had noticed him noticing. She did not say anything. "There are chickens in the coop past the barn," he said. "About 15 of them. They need feeding morning and evening. If that is something you are willing to take on, I would be grateful." "I can do that," she said, and the kitchen garden is overgrown. It has not been what it should be this season. I will look at it. I will be out on the range most of the day today. My hand Clem Purdy comes in around midday. He is a good man. He will not bother you." She nodded. Then she said quietly, "I did not come here to cause you trouble, Mr. Ashford." He looked up. "I know that. You do not know anything about me." "No," he said evenly, "but I know what I see." She looked at him. She looked at him for a long beat, and something in her eyes changed. It was subtle, barely perceptible, the way ice shifts in early thaw when it is still too cold to melt but the structure has already begun to alter beneath the surface. "I appreciate what you have done," she said, "opening your door, not asking." "I will ask," he said, "when you are ready to tell me." She nodded once and looked back at her plate. He put on his hat, collected his gloves from the hook by the back door, and went out to start his day. Clem Purdy arrived at noon as promised, a bow-legged man of 45 with a gray mustache and an outlook on life that was simultaneously suspicious and good-natured. He came around to the barn where Wallace was repairing a saddle and dropped to a stool nearby and said, without any preamble, "There is a woman in your kitchen." "Yes," said Wallace. "And a baby," said Clem. "Yes." Clem chewed the inside of his cheek for a moment. "You want to explain that?" "Not particularly," said Wallace. "Is she going to be staying on?" "For a time." Clem nodded slowly, processing this information with the care of a man who had learned that Wallace Ashford did not do things without reasons, even if he did not always share those reasons. "She made biscuits," Clem said eventually. "I came in for water and she offered me biscuits." "She is a good cook," said Wallace. "She had a rifle leaned up against the wall. She is also a practical woman." Clem scratched his jaw. "All right," he said finally, and picked up a piece of the broken harness that was waiting to be dealt with, and that was the end of the discussion. The days arranged themselves into a rhythm that surprised Wallace with how naturally it formed. He rose early, went to the barn, came back at 7 to a cooked breakfast, spent the day on the land, came back at dusk to a supper that was always something real, something that required thought and effort, not just fuel heated and consumed. In between, Letitia moved through the ranch with the kind of quiet competence that was its own form of eloquence. She fed the chickens and collected eggs. She attacked the kitchen garden with determination, pulling weeks of neglect out of the soil by the roots, replanting in neat rows, constructing a small barrier of wire mesh to keep the rabbits out. She mended shirts, including 3 of his that had been waiting in a pile in his room for so long that he had started to think of them as retired rather than broken. She organized his pantry with a system that he found himself understanding instinctively, everything accessible and logical, nothing wasted. And through all of it she carried Rosalind, in the sling or propped on a blanket nearby, narrating quietly to the baby in a low voice that he sometimes caught fragments of when he passed by. Instructions, it seemed. Small observations. The names of plants she was planting. The color of the sky. She was teaching the child to be aware of the world before the child even had words for it. And this, for reasons he could not articulate, moved him deeply. He began to find excuses to be near the house in the late afternoons. He told himself it was because the fence posts near the south garden needed checking. He told himself it was because the chicken coop roofing was showing signs of rot. He told himself it was good land management and responsible ownership, all of which was technically true and all of which was. He was willing to admit to himself in the dark of his room at night, not the real reason. The real reason was that watching Letitia Garner exist in the space of his ranch had become the most interesting thing he had seen in years. On the 6th evening, she came and sat on the porch while he was smoking his pipe, which he did every evening, 1 pipe, the last thing before bed. She had Rosalind in her arms, the baby awake and drowsy, making the small sounds that babies made when they were floating on the edge of sleep. Letitia sat in the second chair, the one that no one ever sat in, and she pulled a shawl around herself and looked out at the range. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. After a while, Rosalind dropped fully asleep and Letitia shifted the baby against her shoulder and said, without looking at him, "Her father is dead." He kept his eyes on the range. "I am sorry." "He was not a good man," she said, and her voice was absolutely level, carrying neither grief nor relief, just the plain fact of it. "He was not cruel, but he was weak in the ways that matter when there is a child involved. He drank. He owed money to men who do not forget what they are owed." Wallace did not move. "He died in April," she said. "In a card game in Waco, a man named Harlan Doss put a gun on him over a debt. The debt was $17. She paused. "The men that Harlan Doss works for came to our house 3 weeks later. They said the debt transferred to me. They said they would settle it in other ways if I could not produce the money." She said this with no trembling in her voice, with no visible flinching, but her arms around the baby tightened slightly, just slightly, and Wallace saw it. "I left that night," she said, "took Rosalind and my rifle and what food I could carry." "How long were you riding before you came here?" he asked. 11 days. He let out a slow breath. 11 days with a 4-month-old infant and a rifle and men looking for her. He thought about the bruise on her jaw, which had faded to almost nothing now, but which he had not forgotten. "The bruise," he said carefully. "Was that before you left or during?" A pause. "During. I stopped at a farmhouse 2 days out of Waco. The man there was less hospitable than you." The simple way she said it, comparing him favorably to a man who had put his hands on her, nearly made him set down his pipe so he could put both hands on the rail and breathe properly. He did not do that. He sat still. "Those men," he said, "do you think they followed?" "I rode hard," she said. "I changed directions twice." "I do not know. I think I have enough distance, but I do not know." He nodded. He thought about the layout of the double-A, the high ground to the north, the creek on the east that would slow riders, the fact that he had a Winchester of his own and that Clem Purdy, who seemed mild-mannered, had served 2 years scouting for the United States Army during the Comanche campaigns and could read a landscape like a book. "You are safe here," he said. "I want you to understand that." She turned her head and looked at him, and it was the first time she had looked directly at him during this entire conversation. Her eyes, in the fading light, were very dark and very warm and very careful. "You do not owe me that," she said. "I am not saying it because I owe it," he said. "I am saying it because it is true." She held his gaze for a long moment, and he held hers, and then Rosalind stirred and made a small indignant sound, and Letitia looked back down at her daughter, and the moment passed. But something had changed. He could feel it the way you could feel a change in the barometric pressure before a storm, not yet the thing itself, but the clear premonition of it. She said good night and took Rosalind inside, and Wallace sat on the porch for a long time after, smoking his pipe past the point when it had gone out, looking at the land that had always been his, that had always been enough, and wondering when it had begun to feel slightly too quiet. The following Saturday, he drove the wagon into the town of Harlow to collect supplies and mail and to file some paperwork at the land office. He had not planned to mention Letitia to anyone, which meant that Irma Sweeney, who ran the dry goods store and who knew everything that happened in Harlow within hours of its happening, would certainly have something to say to him. "I hear you have taken in a woman," Irma said, not even pretending to be casual about it. "I have a guest at the ranch," he said. "A woman and a baby," Irma pressed. "Yes." Irma Sweeney looked at him with the expression of a woman who had been wanting to see Wallace Ashford arrange himself into something resembling a normal family unit for years. "Is she a good sort?" "She is an excellent sort," he said firmly, which was the most he was going to offer, and by his tone she understood it was all she was going to get. He went to the post office and collected his mail and found, among the usual, a letter that had been forwarded through 2 other postmasters, and that had no return address, but that bore his name in handwriting he did not recognize. He opened it on the seat of the wagon before he drove home and found inside a single sheet of paper on which someone had written, in the cramped hand of a barely literate man, "We are looking for a woman and child. She owes. Anyone who is helping her owes too. Best to send her on." There was no signature. There was no postmark that would tell him where it originated. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his coat pocket and drove home with his jaw set and his mind working. That evening after supper, when Rosalind was asleep in the cradle he had fashioned out of an old crate fitted with a piece of quilted flannel, a project he had undertaken quietly on his own, telling himself it was just practical, he showed Letitia the letter. She read it. Her face did not change. "They found you," he said. "They found the direction I went," she said. "They have not found the place yet, or they would not be sending letters. They would simply come. When they do find the place," he said, "and I think they will eventually, I want to be prepared." She set the letter on the table. "This is not your problem, Wallace." She used his first name. She had been using Mr. Ashford up to that moment, and the shift was small, but it landed on him with quiet significance. "It is my ranch," he said. "Whatever is on my land is my concern." "I can move on," she said. "I did not intend to put you in the middle of something." "I stepped aside and let you in," he said. "That makes me a willing participant. I am not asking you to go." She looked at him across the table. The lamp was burning between them, and the shadows played at the edges of the room, and outside the wind moved through the cottonwood trees that lined the far side of the yard. "Why?" she said. It was a genuine question, quiet and direct. "You could have turned me away that first night. You could have thanked me for the cooking and sent me down the road. Why are you doing any of this?" He was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was complicated. The honest answer involved the way she looked at him, the way she moved through his house, the way her voice sounded when she talked to Rosalind, the way the ranch felt now that there were 3 of them in it. The honest answer was not one he was ready to give in full. "Because you came to me," he said, "and you needed somewhere, and I had somewhere." He paused. "That seems like enough reason." She was very still for a moment. Then she said, "It is enough reason, thank you." The next morning Wallace rode into town to see Sheriff Edmund Harp, a man of 52 who had been sheriff in Calhoun County since before Wallace was born and who took a dim view of anyone who sent threatening letters through the postal system. "Harlan Das," the sheriff repeated, when Wallace explained the situation in broad terms, leaving out Letitia's name and keeping the particulars vague. "You know him?" "Know of him. He runs with a man named Claude Ferris who operates out of a settlement south of Waco. They are not what I would call criminals in the grand, organized sense. More like opportunists with guns and no conscience." Harp turned the letter over in his hands. "This is not something I have jurisdiction over, strictly speaking, but I can write to the sheriff in McLennan County and let him know what is happening." "I would appreciate that," said Wallace. "Who is the woman?" Harp asked. "A guest at my ranch," said Wallace. Harp looked at him steadily. "Wallace, I have known you your whole life. If you are asking me to keep something quiet, I will keep it quiet. But you need to tell me what I am keeping quiet." Wallace told him, not everything, but enough. Her name, the circumstances, the child, the letter. Harp was quiet for a long moment after, and then he said, "She has got grit, this Letitia Garner." "She has," said Wallace. "You keep your rifle clean," said Harp, "and I will write to McLennan County today." Wallace rode home feeling that he had done the practical things, the reasonable things. He also rode home aware that the practical things were, for the first time in a very long time, not the only things he was thinking about. Clem Purdy, who was not a fool, and who had been watching the situation at the AA with the quiet attention of a man who had been around long enough to recognize the shape of things, approached Wallace one afternoon while they were mending the creek fence together. "She is a fine woman," Clem said, with the casual air of a man making a purely meteorological observation. "She is," said Wallace, "steady, not given to complaints." Clem hammered a staple into a post. "That baby is something. Looks right at you like she has already figured you out." "Rosalind is a remarkable child," said Wallace. "She called me Mr. Purdy this morning," Clem said, and there was unmistakable pride in his voice. "Then she asked me if I knew anything about fixing the latch on the chicken coop. I told her I did. I went and fixed it." He paused. "She said thank you like she meant it, like she actually thought about it before she said it." She does everything like she means it, said Wallace. Clem glanced at him sideways. Yes, he said. I have been noticing you noticing that. Wallace drove a staple in with perhaps more force than was strictly necessary and did not reply. Clem wisely let the subject rest. October arrived, and with it a coolness in the mornings and evenings that made the air on the range crisp and clear and smelling of dry grass and the distant possibility of rain. Letitia had found a box of seed catalogs in the pantry, and had spent several evenings studying them with the focused attention of someone planning a serious undertaking. She came to Wallace one evening and spread a hand-drawn map on the kitchen table, a plan for a proper kitchen garden for next spring, with beds for vegetables, a patch for herbs, and a corner for flowers because, she said matter-of-factly, flowers were not frivolous. They were medicine and spirit both. He leaned over the map with her, and she pointed out each section and explained her reasoning, and he was close enough to smell the soap she used, something plain and clean, and close enough to see the small scar above her right eyebrow that he had never been close enough to notice before. He moved a fraction away and said, "This is well thought out." "You have good soil," she said. "Most people do not use what they have." "I have been using what I have," he said. "I have just been using it for cattle and not much else." She tilted her head. "Cattle are important. They pay the bills," he agreed. "But a garden feeds you," she said, "really feeds you in a different way." He looked at her, at the earnestness in her face, at the way she had said that without any affectation. "You miss having a proper place to grow things," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I have not had a proper place for a great many things," she said. "Not for a while now." He wanted very much to say something that would be equal to that moment, something that acknowledged what she had not quite said. He was not a man of easy words. He was not a man who found sentiment simple to navigate. He said, "This is a proper place. You can treat it like one." She looked at him and he looked at her, and the kitchen was warm, and the lamp was lit, and Rosalind was asleep in the crate cradle that he had made and that now lived in the corner of the kitchen, because she slept better with the sounds of the household around her. And the whole scene was so domestic and so real that Wallace Ashford felt a sensation in his chest that he could only have described as a kind of ache. "All right," she said softly. "All right," he said. He went to bed that night knowing that he was falling in love with Letitia Garner, and that it was not the sudden, dramatic thing that people wrote songs about, but something much more like the way water carved a canyon, patient and persistent and profound. He did not tell her. Not yet. The circumstances were not right, and he was not a man who moved faster than he understood. 3 weeks into October, the trouble they had been half expecting arrived. It was a Tuesday morning, and Wallace had gone to the barn early when he heard hoofbeats from the direction of the road. 2 horses coming at a canter, not a gallop, which meant they were not in a panic, but they were not dawdling either. He went to the barn door and looked out. 2 men rode into the yard and pulled up near the well. They were trail-worn, both of them, in the way that men were after days in the saddle with a purpose that drove them harder than comfort. One of them was wide through the chest, with a beard that had grown in crooked, and the other was younger and rat-faced, with eyes that moved around the property like he was taking inventory. Wallace walked out of the barn with his rifle in his left hand, pointed at the ground. "Morning," he said. "Morning," said the wide one. "This the Ashford place?" "It is. We are looking for a woman, name of Garner, Letitia Garner." The wide one said it without heat, almost pleasantly, which was the part that made Wallace's skin cold. "I do not know that name," said Wallace. "That is funny," said the rat-faced one, "because we have been told she came this direction out of Harlow, and there are not many places between Harlow and the county line." "I have a hired hand and I keep cattle," said Wallace. "I do not make a habit of keeping track of travelers." The wide one looked at the house. His eyes moved to the kitchen window, where a shadow appeared briefly and disappeared. Letitia, who had seen them from inside. "We would like to take a look around," the wide one said. "You would not," said Wallace, and his voice was absolutely calm. He lifted the rifle, not pointing it at anyone specifically, just bringing it to a position where its presence was impossible to mistake. "This is my land. You are not welcome to take a look at anything on it." A silence extended between all three of them. The rat-faced one shifted in his saddle. The wide one looked at Wallace with a kind of assessment, measuring whether he was the kind of man who would actually use what he was holding. Wallace's expression told him, clearly and without any drama, that he was. "The woman owes money," the wide one said. "If you have a legal claim," said Wallace, "you can take it to Sheriff Harp in Harlow. His office is open Monday through Saturday." "We do not need a sheriff," the rat-faced one said. "No," said Wallace, "but I think you need to get off my land. I am going to give you a count of 5 to turn those horses around, and then I am going to lose my patience." The wide one looked at him for another long moment and then did something Wallace had not fully expected. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was almost civil. "We will be back," he said. "I know," said Wallace, "and I will be here." They turned and rode out. Wallace watched until they were off the property and then went inside, where Letitia was standing at the kitchen counter with her own rifle and Rosalind in the sling at her chest, the baby asleep through the whole thing. She looked at him. He looked at her. "How many rounds do you have for that Winchester?" he asked. 43, she said without missing a beat. "Good," he said. "I am going to ride to Harp's office today. Will you be all right here with Clem for a few hours?" "I will be fine," she said. And then quietly, "You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Wallace, yes, thank you." It was different from all the other times she had thanked him. It was lower and fuller, and it carried weight. He went to Harp's that afternoon and found the sheriff had already received a response from McLennan County. Claude Ferris and 2 associates, names including one Harold Becker, were wanted in connection with extortion and assault. The description of Harold Becker matched the wide-chested man in Wallace's yard precisely. "I can deputize you," Harp said, "if it comes to that." "Let us hope it does not come to that," said Wallace. "Let us hope," said Harp, and wrote a letter to the federal marshal's office in Austin that same afternoon. It took 4 days for 2 federal marshals to arrive in Harlow. 4 days during which Wallace did not leave the ranch except for necessity, and during which Clem Purdy slept in the bunkhouse with his old Army carbine cleaned and loaded, and during which Letitia Garner went about her work without complaint or visible fear, though she kept her Winchester near and her eyes sharp. On the second evening of those 4 days, she found him at the corral after supper, leaning on the fence rail and watching the horses, and she came and leaned beside him in the cooling dark. "I never meant for this," she said. "For what? For any of this to become your problem. When I rode in that first evening, I was just looking for somewhere to stop, somewhere that felt, I do not know how to explain it. I was so tired, and I had been riding for so long, and I passed 3 ranches before I got to yours, and I do not know why I stopped here." He thought about that. "Maybe you saw something that looked like a welcome." "I did not even see the ranch until I was almost at the porch," she said. "It was nearly dark." "Then maybe you just knew," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Maybe," she said softly. He turned his head and looked at her profile in the evening dark. She was looking at the horses, at the way they moved in the corral, slow and easy. "I am glad you stopped here," he said. He said it plainly because he was a plain-speaking man, and it was the plain truth. She turned to look at him. Their faces were close, closer than they had been before, the way proximity happened in the dark without the same calculation that daytime required. "I am glad too," she said. They stood together for a while longer, and then Rosalind made a sound from inside the house, and Letitia straightened and said she would go check on her, and she went inside, and Wallace stayed at the fence and looked at the horses and let the night air do what it needed to do to his composure. The federal marshals arrived on a Thursday, and the resolution came faster than Wallace had expected. With the warrants already drawn up in McLennan County, and the location of Harold Becker and his companion established through information that Sheriff Harp had quietly obtained, The marshals were able to arrest both men at a boarding house in a small town 12 miles south of Harlow within 24 hours of their arrival. Harlan Das himself, the man who had originally killed Letitia's husband over $17, was already in custody in Waco for an unrelated assault, a fact that the McLennan County Sheriff confirmed in writing. The specific threat that had followed Letitia Garner across 11 days of riding with her baby and her rifle and her determination, was over. Sheriff Harp rode out to the Double A himself to deliver the news on a Friday afternoon, sitting at Wallace's kitchen table and accepting a cup of Letitia's coffee with unfeigned appreciation. "It is over, Mrs. Garner," he said. "Becker is in federal custody. The charge of the debt your husband owed, which was never legally yours to begin with, has been dismissed. You have nothing to run from." Letitia sat across from the sheriff and listened to this with her hands folded on the table and her expression very controlled and very still. When Harp finished, she nodded slowly. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said. "Wallace is doing as much as anyone's," Harp said, with a glance at Wallace that contained a great deal of meaning and a certain amount of amusement. After Harp left, Letitia stood in the kitchen for a long moment without moving. Wallace watched her from the doorway. Then she said very quietly, "I can leave now." He said nothing. She turned and looked at him. "I mean, I have no more reason to impose. You have been extraordinarily generous and I have no wish to overstay. I can stay," he said. She stopped. "I am asking you to stay," he said. "Not because you have nowhere to go, not because of Rosalind, not because of the cooking or the garden or any practical reason. I am asking you to stay because," he paused. He was not a man of easy words, but he was a man who believed in saying true things directly. "Because this place is better with you in it. Because I would rather you were here than not here. Because in the time you have been at this ranch, I have been more aware of being alive than I have been in longer than I can honestly account for." She looked at him. The kitchen was very quiet. Rosalind was in her cradle in the corner, making the small sounds of a baby dreaming. "Wallace," she said. "I know it is not simple," he said. "I know you have been through a great deal and that trust does not grow overnight. I am not asking for anything immediate. I am just asking you not to go." She pressed her lips together for a moment and looked at her hands, and then she looked back at him. "I do not want to go," she said, and then, like she was giving herself permission, "I have not wanted to go for a while now." Something in his chest unlocked. He was still standing in the doorway and she was still at the table, and the distance between them felt both very short and very significant. "Then stay," he said. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. And then, because he was Wallace Ashford, and because he was not a man who could contain everything in the same moment without doing something with his hands, he went to the stove and picked up the coffee pot and refilled both their cups, and they sat at the table together in the afternoon light and talked, really talked, the way they had not quite managed to do yet, without any urgency driving them and without any threat hanging in the air. She told him about growing up in Georgia, the daughter of a tenant farmer, the third of 5 children. She told him about coming west when she was 18 with a man named Philip Garner who had bright ideas and a quick smile, and whose better qualities had gradually been outpaced by his weaknesses. She told him about the early years of her marriage, the parts that had been good, the hope that had existed before the disappointments began to stack up. She did not speak of Philip with bitterness, which he respected. She spoke of him with a kind of clear-eyed sadness that was harder and more honest than bitterness would have been. He told her about his father, who had built the Double A from nothing, who had been a hard man in the way that the frontier made men hard but a decent one underneath. He told her about his mother, who had painted watercolors in the evenings and who had sung to herself while she cooked, and how the house had been different after she was gone, quieter in a way that was not peaceful. He told her about the years of building the ranch up, the droughts and the hard winters and the cattle fever that had taken half his herd 3 years ago and that he had spent the last 2 years recovering from. She listened to all of it. She asked questions. She was interested, genuinely interested, in the way that people were interested when they were paying attention, because they wanted to understand rather than because they were being polite. By the time the light had shifted to the amber gold of late afternoon, they had moved from the kitchen table to the porch, and Rosalind was awake and sitting on Letitia's lap reaching for the air with her small hands, and Clem Purdy had made himself diplomatically scarce for the entire afternoon, which was a kindness that Wallace appreciated and would remember. "Can I hold her?" Wallace asked, nodding at Rosalind. Letitia looked at him for a moment, and then she smiled, the first real full smile he had seen from her, unguarded and warm and transformative. "Yes," she said, and passed the baby to him. Rosalind settled against his arm with the equanimity of a child who had been handled enough to know whether a pair of hands was safe or not. She looked up at him with her dark eyes and appeared to find him acceptable. He held her carefully, the way you held something irreplaceable, and he looked down at her and something in his chest did that thing again, that shifting, that warmth that was too large for its container. "She likes you," Letitia said. "She is looking at me like she is deciding," he said. "She has already decided," Letitia said. "She decided weeks ago. She reaches for you when you walk by." He had not known that. He thought back through the preceding weeks and realized with a slight disorientation that he had been too busy trying not to look at Letitia to notice what Rosalind was doing. "She has good judgment," he said. "She has excellent judgment," Letitia agreed. And when he looked up from the baby, Letitia was looking at him with something in her eyes that was warm and clear and real, something that had shed all its caution, even just for this moment, even just for the length of a breath. The weeks turned into November, and November in Calhoun County was cold and clear. The sky, a brilliant winter blue that made the pale gold of the dead grass on the range look like it had been designed for contrast. The Double A settled into itself differently now, not just the house occupied in a new way but the entire property, as if the land could tell that something had changed in its center and was rearranging itself accordingly. Clem Purdy, who had always been a good worker and a reliable man, became something almost more like family in those months, drawn in by the gravitational pull of the warmth that was accumulating at the ranch house. He took to carving small wooden toys in the evenings, shapes that Rosalind could hold in her hands, smooth-edged blocks, and a small horse that he whittled from cottonwood. He left them on the kitchen table without comment, one at a time, appearing over the course of several weeks, and Letitia thanked him each time with the specific, thoughtful gratitude that was one of her particular gifts, the kind that made people feel their efforts had been truly seen. Wallace noticed that she gave this to everyone. The postmaster in Harlow, the woman at the dry goods store, Harp's deputy, who was barely 19 and who blushed every time she spoke to him. She had a quality of complete attention that was rare enough that people felt the difference of it, even if they could not have said why they felt better after speaking with her. He watched her do it, and he felt proud of her, which surprised him, because he was aware that pride was not something you felt for someone you had no claim to. And he was also aware that he wanted to have a claim, that the idea of a claim had been growing in him for weeks with the patient insistence of something very deeply rooted. He asked her, on a cold November evening when they were both sitting by the fire after supper, Rosalind asleep upstairs in the spare room where Letitia had by now arranged everything to her satisfaction with the determination of a woman who understood that space could be made habitable by sheer will. He asked her the question he had been carrying for some time. "Would you tell me," he said carefully, "how you came to know to stop at the Double A that first night?" She looked up from the shirt she was mending. "I told you I did not know. You rode past 3 other ranches," he said. "I have thought about this." She was quiet for a moment. Then she set the shirt in her lap and said, "A woman in Harlow. I stopped for water at the edge of town. She was sitting on her porch and we spoke briefly. I asked if there was a place outside of town where a person might be received without a lot of questions." She paused. "She said there was a rancher named Ashford about 6 miles east. She said he was a good man. She said that was enough." He thought about this. "Who was she?" "She did not give me her name," Letitia said. "She was older, white-haired." She had a rocking chair and a very direct way of looking at you. He knew exactly who it was. He said, "Mrs. Hannigan, the widow Hannigan. She lives at the edge of town. You know her." "She was a friend of my mother's," he said. Letitia was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "She sent me to you." "She did," he said. The fire moved between them, and the old widow's quiet intervention hung in the air of the room like something that was more than coincidence, and that neither of them was willing to reduce by examining it too precisely. In December, Wallace drove into Harlow and went to see the minister, not because he had decided to ask Letitia anything specific, but because he wanted to know what the procedural elements would look like when he did, and he was a thorough man who did not like to be unprepared. The minister, a calm and practical man named Reverend Elias Cord, told him what he needed to know and then said, with the gentle frankness of a man who had been dealing with human hearts for 30 years, "Does she know?" "She knows how I feel," said Wallace. "We have not had the conversation." "You might consider having it," said Reverend Cord. "I am getting there," said Wallace. He got there on the 19th of December, 1882, on an evening that was cold enough to make the windows frost at their edges and warm enough inside that they had not bothered to light the lamp yet because the fire gave light enough. Rosalind was asleep. The house was very quiet. He had been sitting near the fire and she had been nearby, and he had been aware of her presence in the particular way he was always aware of her presence now, not anxiously but completely, the way you were aware of weather or gravity or any other thing that was simply true and all around you. He said, "Letitia." She looked up. She must have heard something different in his voice because she set down what she was doing immediately. "I want to tell you something," he said. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at her directly. "And I want to say it plainly because I have never been good at saying things in complicated ways and because you deserve plain things said plainly." "All right," she said. "I love you," he said. "I have been falling in love with you since before I knew what was happening to me, and I am now fully there, and I want to know if you would be willing to marry me, to make all of this official, to make the ranch yours and make Rosalind's life here permanent, to be my wife." She looked at him for a very long time. The fire moved. The wind moved against the walls of the house. "Wallace," she said. "Yes. I am not easy," she said. "I need you to know that. I have opinions and I am not good at pretending I do not have them. I get angry when things are unjust. I need to feel that my voice matters, that I am not just kept." "You are the least likely person I know to be kept," he said, and there was warmth and certainty in his voice. "I am not asking you to be kept. I am asking you to be my partner. There is a difference." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I love you too." She said it like she had been deciding whether to let it out, and had finally decided that holding it was more cost than she was willing to pay. "I have loved you I think since that first morning when you made no demands and put coffee in front of me like it was a simple and obvious thing to do." He got up from where he was sitting and crossed the room to where she was, and he sat next to her, and he took her hands in his, and he looked at her face, and she looked at his. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He kissed her then properly, and she kissed him back. And outside the Texas wind moved across the range, and the fire burned warm and steady. And the world, which had been a hard and complicated place for a long time for both of them, chose that moment to feel, just briefly, like it had arranged itself into something very nearly perfect. They married in January of 1883 in Reverend Cord's small church in Harlow, on a Saturday morning when the air was cold and clear, and the sky was the pale winter blue that Wallace had grown up with. It was not a large wedding. There was no one to invite from Letitia's family in Georgia, and Wallace's only remaining family was a cousin in Dallas who received a letter but could not make the distance in time. But Clem Purdy stood up beside Wallace in his best clothes, which he had clearly ironed himself with considerable effort, and Irma Sweeney from the dry goods store, who had taken a strong personal interest in the whole affair, sat in the front pew with Mrs. Hannigan beside her, the old widow who had sent Letitia to the Double A that first evening, and who wept openly throughout the ceremony without any apparent embarrassment. Letitia wore a dress she had made herself from fabric that Irma Sweeney had pressed on her, with the firmness of a woman who would not take no as an answer, a deep blue wool that was practical and warm, and that she had trimmed at the collar with a narrow piece of cream lace she had brought from Georgia, one of the only things she had carried with her all the way from her old life. She wore her hair up, and she carried Rosalind in one arm and the small bouquet of dried winter flowers that Mrs. Hannigan had put together with the other, and when she walked down the aisle of that small church toward Wallace Ashford, who was standing at the front with his hat in his hands, and his face carrying an expression of such complete and undisguised feeling that Clem had to look at the ceiling to maintain his composure, she walked like a woman who had earned this arrival and who knew it. The ceremony was short and the vows were traditional, and when Reverend Cord pronounced them married, Wallace kissed her properly in front of everyone, and Rosalind grabbed a fistful of his collar and held on, which made everyone in the church laugh. And the sound of laughter in that cold January church was the best sound Wallace Ashford had heard in years. Irma Sweeney held a small gathering at the dry goods store afterward, with food that half the town seemed to have contributed, and Sheriff Harp came and shook Wallace's hand and looked at Letitia with frank respect and said, "You have done well for yourself, Mrs. Ashford," and Letitia looked at him with her clear, direct eyes and said, "Yes, I have." The ride home to the Double A that afternoon was quiet and beautiful, the two of them side by side on the wagon seat with Rosalind bundled between them and the pale winter light on the range, and Letitia leaned against Wallace's shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they rode the 6 miles home without needing to say very much because everything that needed saying had been said. The spring came early in 1883, and Letitia's kitchen garden was more ambitious than anything Wallace had previously imagined a garden could be. She had the beds ready before March was out, working alongside Wallace on the weekends when he could spare the time, and she had him build her 3 raised frames along the south side of the house, where the sun came for the longest. She planted tomatoes, beans, squash, turnips, carrots, onions, 2 kinds of peppers, and in the corner she had designated for medicine and spirit both, she put in lavender and chamomile and a rosebush that Irma Sweeney had donated from her own garden, a climbing variety that would need a trellis by summer. By June the garden was producing more than 2 people, and an occasional visit from Clem Purdy could consume, and Letitia began sending things into town on the wagon, vegetables wrapped in cloth, contributing to what there was in Harlow to be shared or sold or given to families who were having a harder time than they were. This was not discussed or decided. It was simply what Letitia Garner Ashford did, because waste was something she had strong feelings about, and community was something she understood in her bones. Rosalind, who in January had learned to pull herself upright by gripping the furniture, and who by March was taking determined, unsteady steps across the kitchen floor, and who by June was walking with the focused intensity of a person who had only recently discovered the ability and intended to use it to its full extent, was everywhere. She was interested in everything. She brought Wallace rocks and sticks, and on one occasion, a confused but unharmed toad. She had Letitia's directness and Wallace's patience, and a quality of her own that was entirely her, a kind of joyful insistence on engaging with whatever was in front of her that was both exhausting and extraordinary. Wallace read to her in the evenings. He had not read aloud to anyone since his mother had asked him to read to her during the last months of her illness, and doing it now, with Rosalind warm and heavy against his side and Letitia at the other end of the room with her sewing or her catalog studying or her letter writing, was a thing so quietly perfect that he sometimes had to stop in the middle of a page and just hold the moment for a second before continuing. Letitia noticed. She always noticed. In August, she told him she was expecting. She told him in the morning, after breakfast, before he went out to the barn, in the same direct and unhesitating way that she said everything. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand and looked at her and felt something so large move through him that he was not sure his body was adequate to contain it. "When?" he asked. "March," she said, "by my reckoning." He put his hat down on the table and crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and kissed her, and she put her hands on his arms and kissed him back. And Rosalind, who had come toddling in from the other room and who was watching this with the open curiosity of a person who was still assembling the basic data of the world, reached up and grabbed his trouser leg and said, "Up," which was her current universal solution to any situation. He picked her up. He held both of them, his wife and the daughter who was as much his as she was anyone's, and the morning light came in through the kitchen window and lay gold across the floor. "March," he said. "March," she agreed. He went out to the barn and stood for a moment in the quiet and the smell of hay and horses, and he was not ashamed of the fact that his eyes were wet. The baby was born on a cold night in the second week of March 1884, with a midwife named Mrs. Flores who came out from Harlow at the first sign of labor, and who was competent and firm, and who put Wallace to work boiling water and making himself useful rather than anxious, which was exactly the right approach. Clem Purdy sat on the porch in the cold with his hat in his hands and did not leave. It was a long night and then it was not, and the sound that came from the bedroom in the small hours of the morning was the specific furious sound of a newborn announcing its arrival with maximum conviction. Mrs. Flores came to the doorway and said, "A boy, Mr. Ashford, healthy and loud." Wallace went in and found Letitia with the baby at her chest, exhausted and luminous, the way she always was, the way she was when she was most completely herself, and the baby was red-faced and already settling, already finding the warmth of his mother. "Come and see your son," Letitia said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the boy, dark hair like Rosalind. His nose was already Wallace's nose, definitive and direct. "What shall we call him?" Letitia asked. They had discussed names, they had a list of possibilities, but sitting there at 3 in the morning with the world very quiet and this new person in the room for the first time, only one name felt right. "Thomas," he said. It was his father's name. She looked at him. She knew why. "Thomas," she agreed. "Thomas James Ashford." James had been her father's name. Outside the window the Texas sky was beginning, at its very eastern edge, to consider the possibility of dawn. Clem Purdy was still on the porch. Rosalind was asleep in her room, unaware that her world had added someone new to it. The double A was still and dark and warm. Wallace held his son, carefully, as he had learned to hold carefully in the previous 2 years of holding Rosalind, and Thomas looked up at him with the unfocused gaze of the very newly arrived, and seemed, in his small squinting way, to be deciding whether the face above him was acceptable. He must have concluded that it was, because he stopped squinting and simply looked, and Wallace looked back, and between them passed something wordless and absolute. Rosalind met her brother in the morning with a focused inspection that involved poking at his feet and staring at his face, and then looking up at her parents with an expression that suggested she found him interesting but was reserving final judgment. By the end of the week she had decided he was acceptable and had taken to bringing him things. Rocks, sticks, the small wooden horse that Clem had carved, arranged around his blanket like offerings. Clem came in to see the baby on the first morning, standing in the doorway with his hat and his gray mustache, and his face doing something that was clearly a great deal of feeling being very poorly concealed. "Fine boy," he said. "He is," said Wallace. "Looks like you," said Clem to Wallace. "He does," said Letitia, with the particular warmth she put into saying things that were genuinely true. Clem stood for another moment. Then he said, "I carved him something. It is on the porch." It was a small wooden cradle rocker, fitted together with a precision that spoke of many evenings of careful work, smooth finished and solid, the kind of thing that would last for generations. Letitia stood at the door and looked at it and then turned to look at Clem and said, "Clem Purdy, this is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." Clem went a remarkable shade of red and said something about it being just a bit of wood and went back to the barn, and Wallace watched him go with a deep and genuine affection. The years settled in the way that good years did, not dramatically or memorably day by day, but richly and solidly in the mass of them, like good soil building up in the beds of rivers. The double A grew. Wallace added to his herd in 1885 and hired 2 more hands in 1886, young men named Pedro Rivera and James Salt, who were both excellent with cattle, and who treated Letitia with the respectful politeness of people who understood instinctively where the center of authority on this ranch actually resided. Letitia continued to run the household and the garden, and, increasingly, the bookkeeping of the ranch, which she had begun doing, because she noticed that Wallace's system was functional but imprecise, and that there was money being lost in the imprecision. She sat with the account books in the evenings and developed a system that was exact and clear, and when she presented it to him, she was slightly braced for defensiveness, which was how most men of that era received the suggestion that a woman might be better at something they had been doing themselves. He looked at the new system and said, "This is better." She looked at him. "You are not. It is a better system," he said. "I never liked the numbers, and you are clearly good at them. Will you keep doing it?" She kept doing it. In the spring of 1887, Rosalind, who was 5 years old and who attended the school in Harlow with the same fierce attention she applied to everything, came home one day with a bruised knee and a story about a boy who had said something rude to her about her mother not being a real Ashford because she had been born a Garner. Rosalind had apparently informed this boy, with the precision of someone who had been thinking through arguments since before she could walk, that being born a Garner was one of the best things that had ever happened to anyone, and that he was welcome to reconsider his position. The bruised knee was from falling while making this point with some emphasis, not from any altercation. Wallace sat with Rosalind and her bruised knee and said, "Your mother is the most real thing I know." Rosalind looked at him with her mother's direct eyes. "I told him that," she said. "Not those words, but I told him." He kissed the top of her head and said she had done exactly right. He told Letitia that evening, sitting on the porch in the spring dark, the way he told her everything of consequence. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "I want to adopt her officially, legally." He looked at her. "She is my daughter," Letitia said. "She has always been my daughter. I want there to be a legal document that says that Rosalind Ashford's mother is Letitia Ashford." "We can do that," he said. "We should do that." They went to the county courthouse in the fall of 1887, and the judge, who had heard the name Wallace Ashford and the story of the double A and who knew the Ashford family's reputation in Calhoun County, signed the papers with no hesitation, and Rosalind Jane Ashford became legally and permanently and officially the daughter of both Wallace and Letitia Ashford, which she had been in every way that mattered for 5 years already. Rosalind, who was by now 6 and fully capable of understanding what had happened, said when they told her, "So it is just official now." "Just official now," said Letitia. "Good," said Rosalind, and went back to the thing she had been doing, which was an elaborate construction project in the yard involving sticks and string, and a complex set of rules that she had explained to Thomas, and that Thomas was largely ignoring. Thomas, who was 4, was a different kind of child than his sister. Where Rosalind was sharp and quick and verbal, Thomas was thoughtful and physical and deeply interested in how things worked. He took apart anything that could be taken apart and usually, with increasing success as he grew older, put it back together again. He followed Wallace to the barn with a seriousness of purpose that made the ranch hands smile, and he asked questions about everything. Not the rapid-fire questions of a curious child, but the slow, considered questions of someone who was genuinely trying to understand the mechanics of the world. He was going to be a rancher. It was obvious to everyone, including Thomas, who had already declared it at age 4 with the same calm certainty his mother brought to most pronouncements. Letitia looked at her son one afternoon when he was sitting with Wallace in the barn, The two of them bent over a broken piece of harness with identical expressions of focused concentration, and she felt something so full and so warm in her chest that she had to stand still for a moment and just feel it. This was the life she had not known how to want because she had never known it was possible. This was the thing she had been riding toward across 11 days of desperate open country, not knowing it, carrying it only as a faint instinct in the direction of safety and shelter. She went back into the house and started supper and hummed a song her mother had taught her when she was small, a Georgia song, a song about water and green things and coming home, and the kitchen smelled of the rosemary she had dried from the garden and the bread that was proving in the warmth near the stove. And through the window she could see the range in the last golden light of the afternoon, and the two of them coming back across the yard together, the big man and the small, serious boy, walking in step. Mrs. Hannigan died in the winter of 1888, peacefully in her bed, at an age that no one was entirely certain of, but that Reverend Cord estimated at somewhere in the mid-80s. She had been in declining health for 2 years, and Letitia had gone to see her regularly during that time, bringing things from the garden and the kitchen, and sitting with her in the afternoons, talking or reading or simply keeping the company of a person who was growing tired of the world but not yet ready to entirely release it. On the afternoon before she died, Mrs. Hannigan had taken Letitia's hand and said, with the directness of a woman who had outlived her need for social circumspection, "I knew the moment I looked at you that he was what you needed." "You knew a great deal," Letitia said. "I knew his mother," Mrs. Hannigan said. "She was a woman who understood quality. Her boy got her sense of it. I thought to myself, this tired woman with her baby and her rifle and her spine made of iron, she needs someone with quality. And so I sent her along." She patted Letitia's hand. "I was right." "You were entirely right," said Letitia. Mrs. Hannigan closed her eyes with the satisfied expression of a woman who had accomplished the necessary. They buried her in the Harlow churchyard on a cold January day, and the whole town came because Mrs. Hannigan had known the whole town, and Wallace held Letitia's hand throughout, and afterward she leaned against him and said, "She changed everything. She just pointed and everything changed." "Some people do that," he said. "They see the thing that needs connecting and they connect it." "I want to be that kind of person," she said. He looked at her. "You already are," he said. "You have been doing it since you arrived." She looked up at him in the winter churchyard with the bare trees around them and the pale sky above and his hand warm around hers. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. "More than the first day." "More than the first day," she agreed. They walked home, eventually, through the town and out to where the wagon waited, and the children were with Clem in the wagon already, Rosalind reading and Thomas trying to read over her shoulder and being firmly told to stop. And it was an ordinary scene of extraordinary ordinary life. And Wallace helped Letitia up to the seat and climbed up beside her and took the reins, and Clem sat in the back with the children, and they drove home to the Double A in the winter light with the road clear before them. The second girl arrived in the summer of 1889, and they named her Marion, for no particular reason except that Letitia had always liked the name, and that it suited the child, who was fair where Thomas was dark and placid where Rosalind had been intense, a baby who seemed to regard the world with a kind of serene acceptance that was both restful and somewhat disarming in its totality. Rosalind, who was 7, immediately appointed herself responsible for Marion's education in the practical aspects of life, a project she took seriously, and that Marion, as she grew into a small person, seemed entirely agreeable to. The Double A by 1890 was a real operation. 3 full-time ranch hands beside Clem, a herd of nearly 100 head, the kitchen garden that had become something significantly more serious than a kitchen garden, supplying produce to a regular list of households and the small mercantile in Harlow. Letitia's bookkeeping had evolved into a full accounting system, and she had, through a correspondence that had begun with a letter to an agricultural newspaper in 1887, connected with a network of women across Texas who were running or co-running frontier operations, and who exchanged information about crops, livestock, legal rights, and the thousand practical complexities of life on the frontier with the straightforward efficiency of people who could not afford to waste resources. She had also, quietly and without making a point of it, helped 3 women in the area of Harlow who were in situations that she recognized from her own experience, situations of debt or threat, or the particular vulnerability of being alone with a child and nowhere safe to stop. She helped them with money where she could, with information always, with the kind of practical clear-eyed assistance that made a difference between surviving and going under. Wallace knew about this. He supported it entirely, not by making speeches about it, but by being the kind of man who understood that his wife's resources and his wife's efforts were her own to apply as she saw fit, which was, in the context of 1890 Texas, not as common an understanding as it should have been. He loved her more with every year. It was not the love of the early days, the discovery and the ache of it, the newness and the almost painful awareness. It was deeper and more structural, the way the foundations of a good building were not the most visible part, but were the reason everything else stood. He knew her completely, her anger at injustice and her patience with people she loved. Her humor, which was dry and precise, and which she deployed when he least expected it, undoing him regularly. Her grief, which she carried quietly for her husband who had been weak in the ways that mattered, for her old life in Georgia that she had lost so young, for Mrs. Hannigan, for all the things that the frontier asked of a person that had no clean resolution. He held her grief when she let him, and she held his, and this was what love was in the long run in the version that lasted. In 1891, Clem Purdy retired from active ranch work on account of his knees, which had made their position on this question increasingly clear over the previous year. He did not leave the AA. He moved into the smaller room in the house, where he had been sleeping during the worst of the winter for several years already, and he became, officially and without ceremony, part of the family. He helped with the children, particularly with Thomas, who regarded Clem with the reverence due a man who had served with the army and who could make anything out of wood, and who knew the names of every bird and plant on the Texas range. He kept his workshop in the barn and produced an ongoing series of wooden objects, furniture and toys and small practical items, with the patience of someone who had found his ideal occupation only after decades of other things. Rosalind, who was 9 in 1891, and who was by now the sharpest student in the Harlow School and a source of both pride and mild exasperation to her teachers, had declared her intention to become a doctor. Not a nurse, a doctor. She had said it at the supper table with the flat certainty of someone announcing a fact of geography, and the table had been quiet for a moment. Letitia said, "Then you will need to work very hard." Rosalind said, "I know that." Wallace said, "We will make sure you have what you need." Rosalind looked at each of them in turn and then went back to her supper, satisfied, the matter settled. The years that followed were the years of building, of the long, quiet accumulation of a life well lived and well loved. Thomas grew into himself with the steadiness that had always been in him, broad and capable and deeply attached to the land, the kind of young man who walked a fence line the way his father did, with care and ownership and love for the thing itself. He was 17 in 1901, and he was already, by anyone's reckoning, a rancher in the full sense of the word. Marion grew into her serenity and complicated it with an unexpected gift for music, playing the piano that Wallace bought for Letitia in 1893, and that Letitia played adequately, but that Marion played with a natural fluency that astonished everyone, including Marion herself, when she first sat down at it at age 5. By 12, she was giving lessons to the children of Harlow, and by 15 she was playing at every significant occasion in the town. Rosalind went east for her education in 1899 to a women's college in Ohio, on the strength of academic work that had made her teachers write letters of recommendation that went further in their praise than such letters generally went. She wrote to her parents every week, letters that were dense with ideas and arguments and observations, and Letitia wrote back with equal density, and Wallace added his own pages. And the correspondence was a living thing that kept all of them connected across the distance. On a November evening in 1895, Wallace and Letitia sat on the porch in the particular way they had been sitting on the porch for 13 years, side by side, her leaning slightly against him, his arm around her, the pipe going, the dark range in front of them. "Do you ever think about that first evening?" he asked. "I think about it often," she said. "What do you think when you think about it?" She was quiet for a moment, the way she was quiet when she was considering something seriously. "I think about how close it was," she said. "How easily I might have turned around at the gate, how easily you might have said no." "I would not have said no," he said. "You did not know that," she said. "You did not know anything about me." "No," he said, "but I know what I did. I looked at you and I stepped aside." "Yes," she said, "you did." She paused. "Why, Wallace, honestly, why?" He thought about it, really thought about it. The way the moment had felt. The gray mare and the baby and the rifle and the dust settling and her eyes meeting his with that absolute directness. "Because you had clearly come a long way," he said, "and you were still upright, and that seemed like something that deserved a door being opened." She turned her face and looked at him. In the dark her eyes were warm and steady. "I was so tired," she said. "I know. I was so tired, and I was terrified, and I had been holding it together for 11 days across open country because there was no alternative. And then I stopped in front of your house, and you opened the door and stood aside, and all I could think was," she stopped. "What?" he said gently. "That it was the first time since Philip died that a person had made room for me without wanting something from me immediately in return." She paused. "That is a thing that sounds like a low bar." "It is not a low bar," he said. "It is the right bar." She leaned closer against him. "No, it is not a low bar." She was quiet. "And then I stayed and the bar got higher and higher and you kept clearing it and now here we are." "Here we are," he said. "Here we are," she said. And there was something in the way she said it that contained the whole of it. The ranch and the children and the garden and the years and Clem asleep inside, and the horses in the barn and the range stretching out in the November dark, and all of it theirs, real and solid and built out of the small brave decision of a woman who had ridden up to a porch with a baby and a rifle and no explanation, and a man who had stepped aside and said, "Come in." He held her in the dark, on their porch, in the November of their 13th year, and the land was very quiet and very large around them, and the stars were thick and layered the way they always were out here away from any town, and everything that had ever needed resolving was resolved, and everything that had ever needed building was built, and everything that had ever needed loving was loved. Inside the house, Clem snored softly in his chair by the fire. Thomas was in his room with a book on cattle breeding that Wallace had ordered for him from a publisher in Chicago. Marian was playing a quiet piece on the piano, something slow and sweet that drifted through the walls and out onto the porch where her parents sat. Letitia closed her eyes and listened to her daughter play. Wallace held her and listened too. The music moved out into the night, into the dark of the Texas range, into the cold November air, and dissipated somewhere over the pale dry grass and the sleeping cattle, going wherever music went when the last of it was played. They stayed on the porch for a long time after the music stopped. They had nowhere they needed to be. They were already there.